I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The Nauvoo Expositor was no more. The city of Nauvoo's usual tranquility was broken, never to be restored. With the force of Joseph Smith as mayor, prophet president, and lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion pushing the city council to declare the Expositor a public nuisance, the city marshal John P. Green had carried out Joe's orders to destroy the printing office. Major General of the Nauvoo Legion, Jonathan Dunham, had also called out a few hundred members of the city militia to keep the peace, with orders to arrest anybody who opposed the destruction of the press. This was essentially a declaration of martial law in the city for the night. And according to reports from media outside the city of Nauvoo, those arrest orders were indeed executed, although it's tough to know how many people were actually arrested because that night a riot broke out in the chaos and the Legion could barely keep a handle on the city. According to Quilliam Claypen's entry in Joe's journal for that day, quote, "The posse, consisting of some 100, returned with the marshal in front of the mansion, and I gave them a short address, told them that they had done right, that they had executed my orders required of me by the city council, and that I would never submit to have another libelous publication established in the city, that I cared not how many papers were in the city if they would print the truth, but would submit to no libels or slanders from them." The speech was loudly greeted by 3 cheers 3 times. The posse dispersed, all in good order. Francis M. Higbee and others made some threats, which will appear in due course of investigation. End quote. The Marshal and Major General of the Legion had orders to arrest anybody who opposed them or swore out any threats against the church or its leadership for carrying out the order. I can't find any records that Higbee or any of the other publishers of the Expositor were arrested, nor can I find any records of anybody else being arrested, but there's simply no way to, document that. There was no way that the crowd gathered and then dispersed peaceably, as Joe's journal states here. I believe that we can't find records on this for a couple of reasons. There weren't enough jail cells to contain hundreds or thousands of people rioting in response to this act of tyranny. Secondly, destroying the printing press as a public nuisance was one act of tyranny, but then going the next step and arresting one or many of the printers was probably just too blatant even for Joe to follow through with. Third reason why I don't think there are any documents on this, while Marshal Green and Major General Dunham were commissioned officers of the city police and the city militia, the people that they tried to keep from rioting were also their friends and family. Carrying out the draconian orders of arresting anybody who was mad by burning the printing press, that would see these men and the men that they commanded arresting people that they knew and loved. At the end of the day, however, the posse of legionnaires disbanded for the night. The excited mob went home, and most importantly, people either went home to write letters or immediately set off on horseback for overnight rides to cities outside of Nauvoo. In an age of the world churning at the speed of a galloping horse, intel about this outrage was quick to propagate but slow to verify. The press being destroyed was known about in Carthage and Warsaw by the next morning. Carthage and Warsaw, of course, being the hotbeds of the anti-Mormon political party. The impacts of destroying the Nauvoo Expositor are complex and multifaceted. First off, let's talk about the Nauvoo Neighbor. Under the direction of John Taylor, the Nauvoo Neighbor did its best to justify the response arrived at by the city council to destroy the printing press. Quote, "Retributive justice, a knot of base men to further their wicked and malicious designs towards the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to bolster up the intents of blacklegs and bogus makers," it's counterfeit money, "and advocate the characters of murderers, established a press in this city last week and issued a paper entitled the Nauvoo Expositor. The prospectus showed an intention to destroy the charter, and the paper was filled with libels and slanderous articles upon the citizens and city council from one end to the other. A burnt child dreads the fire. The church as a body has individually suffered until forbearance has ceased to be a virtue. The cries and pleadings of men, women, and children with the authorities were, will you suffer that servile, murderous paper to go on and vilify and slander the innocent inhabitants of this city and raise another mob to drive and plunder us again as they did in Missouri? Under these pressing cries and supplications of afflicted innocents, and in the character, dignity, and honor of the corporate powers of the charter as granted to the city of Springfield, and made and provided as a part of our charter for legislative purposes, to declare what shall be a nuisance and to prevent and remove the same, the City Council of Monday, the 10th instant, declared the establishment and expositor a nuisance, and the city marshal and the head of the police in the evening took the press materials and paper into the street and burned them. And in the name of free men, and in the name of God, we beseech all men who have the spirit of honor in them to cease from persecuting us, collectively or individually. Let us enjoy our religion, rights, and peace like the rest of mankind. Why start presses to destroy rights and privileges and bring upon us mobs to plunder and murder? We ask no more than what belongs to us, the rights of Americans." End quote. They tried to make the expositor publishers to be hell spawns, and the Mormons are the innocent and persecuted disciples of Christ. But the fire which destroyed the expositor was confined only to the streets of Nauvoo. The second impact of destroying the expositor was the fact that the press outside of Nauvoo couldn't be so easily silenced. The Warsaw Signal by Thomas Coke Sharp, we've talked about him a lot on the show, issued numerous daily extras covering every piece of intel they received about the city council meetings and the destruction of the press and everything that followed it. Quote, "Unparalleled outrage at Nauvoo. Below we give the particulars of the most diabolical outrage that has ever been perpetrated in this free country. Had it been the act of an excited multitude, it would have appeared much more excusable, but it was the deliberate work of men who acted not from the impulse of a sudden emotion, nor amid the tumult of an intoxicated multitude. It was done in cold blood. And is there anything further needed to exhibit the fiendish and tyrannical disposition of Joe and his satellites? To comment on this most wanton act would be an insult to our readings. The followings are the particulars which appeared in our extra of yesterday." And now it reprints the extra they printed on the 11th. "Mr. Sharp, I hasten to inform you of the unparalleled outrage perpetrated upon our rights and interests by the ruthless, lawless, ruffian band of Mormon mobocrats at the dictum of that unprincipled wretch, Joe Smith. We were privately informed that the city council, which had been in extra session for 2 days past, had enacted an ordinance in relation to libels providing that anything that had been published or anything that might be published tending to disparage the character of the officers of the city should be regarded as lawless. They also declared the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance and directed the police of the city to proceed immediately to the office of the Expositor and destroy the press and also the materials by throwing them into the street. If any resistance were made, the officers were directed to demolish the building and property of all who were concerned in publishing said paper, and also take all into custody who might refuse to obey the authorities of the city. Accordingly, a company consisting of some 200 men armed and equipped with muskets, swords, pistols, bowie knives, sledgehammers, etc., assisted by a crowd of several hundred minions who volunteered their services on the occasion, marching to the building and breaking open the doors with a sledgehammer, commenced the work of destruction in desperation. They tumbled the press and materials into the street and set fire to them, and demolished the machinery with a sledgehammer, and injured the building very materially. We made no resistance, but looked on and felt revenge, but leave it for the public to avenge this climax of insult and injury. Signed, Charles A. Foster, one of the publishers. And now the last piece from the Warsaw Signal, reprinting that extra from yesterday. We received the above communication by the hands of Charles A. Foster about 11:30 today. We have only to state that this is sufficient. War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, Arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball." End quote. The simple fact remained Joe could burn the printing press of an opposition paper in the city of Nauvoo, but the other dozen local and nationwide papers, which had been very critical of him, couldn't be shut down like the Expositor had been. Warsaw and Carthage were the hotbeds of anti-Mormonism, and when I use that term here, it's because it was their own designation. They organized the anti-Mormon party, political party, to oppose the growing political power of the Mormons, much like the many anti-Masonic political parties had been formed to combat the power of Masons in politics at the time. We could use another anti-Mormon political party nowadays, or at least an anti-religious party, in my opinion. But Joe recognized that he'd stepped in it, and he went into full damage control mode. The city council met the morning of the 11th of June, the morning after the printing press was destroyed, and the only minutes taken during that meeting are notably and remarkably short. Where the meeting minutes of the previous days deliberating about the Expositor occupy pages and pages of conversation, this is everything that was recorded for the June 11th meeting. Quote, "Summons was issued for Sylvester Emmons," that's the editor of the Expositor, "to attend the city council on the second Saturday of July, 10 a.m., to answer charges then and there to be preferred versus him for slandering said city council, agreeably to the order of said council passed June 8, 1844. Willard Richards, Recorder." End quote. That was it. That was what Willard Richards recorded anyway, but they met for hours, so we don't know what was discussed, and no other documents exist that I can find which shed more light on this specific city council meeting. Joe did, however, issue a proclamation that day for the public of Nauvoo to observe, not unlike what Russell M. Nelson just issued in the April 2020 General Conference, but the context of this proclamation is a bit different, and Joe issued half a dozen of these proclamations for different dire circumstances during his ministry. Quote, "By virtue of my office as mayor, I do hereby strictly enjoin it upon the municipal officers and citizens of said city to use all honorable and lawful means in their power to assist me in maintaining the public peace and common quiet of said city. I further call upon every officer, authority, and citizen to be vigilant in preventing by wisdom the promulgation of false statements, libels, slanders, or any other malicious or evil-designed concern that may be put in operation to excite and ferment the passions of men to rebel against the rights and privileges of the city, citizens, or laws of the land. To be ready to suppress the gathering of mobs, to repel by gentle means and noble exertion every foul scheme of unprincipled men, and finally, to keep the peace by being cool, considerate, virtuous, unoffending, manly, and patriotic. Signed, Joseph Smith, Mayor." This proclamation was as close to a declaration of martial law that Joe could get without actually officially doing it. However, in the city council meeting which produced this proclamation, somebody leaked an exchange that happened to the Warsaw Signal, and Thomas Sharp quickly distributed another extra for that evening, which showed the intensity that carried that meeting in Nauvoo. Quote, "Further particulars from Nauvoo. We have conversed with a gentleman of undoubted veracity who was in Nauvoo and present in the city council room at the time the ordinance to destroy the Expositor Press was under consideration, and from him we received the following items from the speeches of Joe and Hiram Smith. Joe became very much excited in the course of his speech and appeared wrathy at his own followers because of their not entering into his schemes with sufficient zeal. In giving vent to his feelings, he used the following language," now quoting Joseph Smith apparently, quote, "If you, the people of Nauvoo, will not stick by me and wade to your knees in blood for my sake, you may go to hell and be damned, and I will go and build another city." End quote. The Warsaw Signal says next, "Hiram Smith directed his fire against the press, and in relation to the editor of this paper, the Warsaw Signal, he made use of the following language," now quoting Hiram Smith, We had better send a message to long-nosed Sharp that if he does not look out, he might be visited with a pinch of snuff that will make him sneeze." End quote. At this burst of oratory, the council were convulsed with laughter. In relation to our press, Hiram Smith said, "If any person would go to Warsaw boldly in daylight and break the press of the signal office with a sledgehammer, he would bear him out, if it cost him his farm. He could only be taken with a warrant at any rate, and what good will that do?" These extracts will show the rulers of Nauvoo have doffed their saintly robes and have come out in their true characters of hellish fiends. Yes, Hiram and Joe are as truly devils as though they had served an apprenticeship of half an eternity in the infernal pit. Such a wordsmith, this Thomas Sharp. And now, Hiram, in relation to your threats, we wish no better sport than you should send your minions here to destroy our press. Let them come. We are anxious. As regards your threats to our person, we scorn them. We defy you and your hosts. Recollect that our death will be avenged. You, devil as you are, cannot intimidate us. We will write and publish what we please and as we please." End quote. So, needless to say, the anti-Mormons were now invigorated by the same fire that put the expositor to destruction. This was an outrage which couldn't be tolerated, and Thomas Sharp was calling for open warfare with the Mormon settlement. Let it be made with powder and ball. We will publish what we please. It's pretty transparent. Thomas Sharp knew the implications of what he printed. He also understood that Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith was threatening his own life and the life of his paper, the Warsaw Signal. The Signal was now the target of a similar fate as the Nauvoo Expositor. You see, Thomas Sharp wasn't always an enemy to the Mormons, right? We've talked about him quite a bit on the show, but until he attended the temple cornerstone laying ceremony with the Nauvoo Legion in full uniform parade back in 1841, Thomas Sharp was sympathetic to the plight of the Mormons, like most people in Illinois, or Illinois for some folks apparently. But when Thomas Sharp saw the force that Joseph Smith was able to muster, he knew that he was witnessing the birth of something terrible and destructive. Calling for powder and ball, a war of extermination to answer the destruction of the expositor, meant that he wanted to see Governor Thomas Ford call in the militia. In fact, most of the non-Mormon citizens in the cities outside of Nauvoo wanted the state militia to answer this act of tyranny. The anti-Mormon party, of which Thomas Sharp was one of the founders, met the evening after the expositor was burned to deliberate about how to handle this issue. Now, martial law in Nauvoo didn't extend beyond the boundaries of the city, and this meeting couldn't be stopped by anybody in Nauvoo. However, one of Joe's moles attended the meeting, and they brought back a copy of the resolution and gave it to Joseph Smith. The meetings continued for multiple days before a resolution was finally agreed upon on June 13th. Now, I've tried to cut anything possible to make this a shorter read, but there really is just nothing to cut. Each whereas and each resolution contains so much information. I just have to read this resolution in full. Now, as I read through this, try to consider the mentality of the people as they drafted each line, each whereas, and each resolved. Here we go. Quote, "Whereas information has reached us about which there can be no question, that the authorities of Nauvoo did recently pass an ordinance declaring a printing press and newspaper published by opponents of the prophet a nuisance, and in pursuant thereof did direct the marshal of the city to enter by force the building from whence the paper was issued, and violently to take possession of the press and printing materials and burn and destroy the same. And whereas Hiram Smith did, in presence of the city council, offer a reward for the destruction of the printing press and materials of the Warsaw Signal, a newspaper also opposed to his interest. And whereas the liberty of the press is one of the cardinal principles of our government, firmly guaranteed by the several constitutions of the states as well as the United States. And whereas Hiram Smith has, within the last week, publicly threatened the life of one of our valued citizens, Thomas Sharp, the editor of the Signal. Therefore be it solemnly resolved that, by the citizens of Warsaw. We view the recent ordinance of the city of Nauvoo and the proceedings thereunder as an outrage of an alarming character, revolutionary and tyrannical in its tendency, and being under color of law, as calculated to subvert and destroy the minds of the community all reliance on the law. Resolved, that as a community we feel anxious when possible to redress our grievances by legal remedies. But the time has now arrived when the law has ceased to be a protection to our lives and property. A mob at Nauvoo under a city ordinance has violated the highest privilege in our government, and to seek redress in the ordinary mode would be utterly ineffectual. Resolved, that the public threat made in the council of the city not only to destroy our printing press, but to take the life of its editor, is sufficient in connection with the recent outrage to command the efforts and the services of every good citizen to put an immediate stop to the career of the mad prophet and his demoniac coadjutors. We must not only defend ourselves from danger, but we must resolutely carry the war into the enemy's camp. We do therefore declare that we will sustain our press and editor at all hazards, that we will take full vengeance, terrible vengeance, should the lives of any of our citizens be lost in the effort, that we hold ourselves at all times in readiness to cooperate with our fellow citizens in this state, Missouri and Iowa, to exterminate, utterly exterminate the wicked and abominable Mormon leaders and authors of our troubles. Resolved, that a committee of 5 be appointed forthwith to notify all persons of our township suspected of being the tools of the prophet to leave immediately on pain of instant vengeance. And we do recommend the inhabitants of the adjacent townships to do the same, hereby pledging ourselves to render all the assistance they may require. Resolved, that the time, in our opinion, has arrived when the adherents of Smith as a body should be driven from the surrounding settlements into Nauvoo, that the prophet and his miscreant adherents should then be demanded at their hands, and if not surrendered, a war of extermination should be waged to the entire destruction, if necessary for our protection, of its adherents. And we do hereby recommend this resolution to the consideration of the several townships, to the mass convention to be held at Carthage, hereby pledging ourselves to aid to the utmost the complete consummation of the object in view, that we may thereby be utterly relieved of the alarm, anxiety, and trouble to which we are now subjected. Resolved, that every citizen arm himself to be prepared to sustain the resolutions herein contained. That was an interesting little Freudian slip. End quote. This resolution, passed by the anti-Mormons in Carthage, meant that the next war of extermination was on the hands of the Mormon leadership in consequence of their own actions, right? In Missouri, the war of extermination that they waged there was because of stealing a military supply of convoy, attacking a state militia, burning and pillaging local non-Mormon settlements. In Illinois, the war of extermination, the consequences was the consequence of counterfeit money, debt, political capital, and religious leaders using their own militia to burn down a hostile printing press, an overt act of tyranny and fascism tending towards revolution. Actions have consequences, and wars of extermination the Mormons found themselves in were direct consequences of the actions of Joe and his closest yes-men advisors. So the committee resolved to send this resolution to Governor Thomas Ford. What was going on in Nauvoo during these 3 days that they were holding meetings? Well, Joe was doing his usual legal machinations to try and get himself off the hook. So he agreed to be arrested by a city officer from Carthage, David Bettesworth. But of course, we know Joe, and he wouldn't be arrested without having a plan, right? He knew the provisions that were created by the Nauvoo Charter and expanded powers of writing writs of habeas corpus would just let him off the hook, right? So accordingly, on Wednesday, June 12th, 2 days after the Expositor was destroyed, Joseph Smith was put in cuffs and taken before the Nauvoo Municipal Court, where they held a special hearing on Joe's case. The court was filled with Joseph sycophants, and the proceedings went as expected. The charges were consistent with the violations Joe's enemies alleged against him, that, quote, the accused did commit a riot wherein with force and violence, broke into the printing office and unlawfully and with force burned and destroyed the printing press, type, and fixtures of the same, being the property of the 7 publishers, end quote. So Joseph Smith and 17 other members of the City Council and Nauvoo Legion and the City Marshal were all arrested for this offense. The arrest warrant was sworn out of Carthage, the seat of Hancock County, in which the city of Nauvoo resided. The arresting officer from Carthage, Bedesworth, noted that the warrant for arrest stated, quote, bring them before me or some other justice of the peace to answer the premises and further to be dealt with according to law, end quote. So when the warrant was issued by Justice of the Peace Thomas Morrison, who was a member of the anti-Mormon political party in Carthage, it was obviously issued with the understanding that the case would be heard in Carthage. Joseph Smith, however, when Bedesworth tried to extradite him to Carthage, objected, quote, after the officer got through reading the writ, I referred him to the clause in the writ, before me or some other justice of the peace of said county, saying, we are ready to go to trial before Esquire Johnson or any justice in Nauvoo according to the requirement of the writ. But Bedesworth swore he would be damned, but he would carry them to Carthage before Morrison, who issued the writ, and seemed very wrathy. I asked him if he intended to break the law, for he knew the privilege of the prisoners, and they should have it. I called upon all present to witness that I then offered myself, Hiram did the same, to go forthwith before the nearest justice of the peace, and also called upon them to witness whether the officer broke the law or not. I felt so indignant at his abuse in depriving me of the privilege of the statute of Illinois and going before some other justice that I determined to take out a writ of habeas corpus and signed the following petition, end quote. And the petition that Joseph Smith signed in reaction to this is pretty standard. It's just a writ of habeas corpus, but it has an interesting note in here that's really quite remarkable here. It says, quote, your petitioner further avers that the designs and intention of the said Francis M. Higbee in commencing this prosecution is to commit and carry out more easily a conspiracy against the life of your petitioner, meaning Joseph Smith, that the said Higbee has publicly declared that it was his determination to do everything in his power to throw your petitioner into the hands of his enemies, end quote. Of course, in this writ of habeas corpus, Joe pleaded not guilty to all of the charges of the arrest warrant. And remember, Nauvoo had passed an extra ordinance in the case of Joseph Smith. That's what it was titled, back in November of 1843, which made it so any officer who entered the city of Nauvoo to arrest Joseph Smith could be arrested by the city marshal and imprisoned for life in the city of Nauvoo until an investigation into the merits of his warrant could be adjudicated in the Nauvoo Municipal Court. So this extra ordinance in the case of Joseph Smith effectively nullified any arrest warrant that was issued by anybody for Joseph Smith. Joe made the rules, and the people had to follow them or be accused of breaking the law the way that Joe had accused his current warden, Bedesworth, of doing so. Accordingly, Whiteout Willard Richards issued an order to the city marshal in Nauvoo in view of Joe's writ of habeas corpus and the conflict between Joe and David Bedesworth, the arresting officer from Carthage. Quote, these are therefore to command the said David Bedesworth, that's the arresting officer, constable as aforesaid, to safely have the body of said Joseph Smith in his custody detained, together with the day and cause of his caption and detention before the municipal court of the said city forthwith, to abide such order as the said court shall make in his behalf. And further, if the said David Bedesworth or other persons or person having said Joseph Smith of said city in Nauvoo in custody shall refuse or neglect to comply with the provisions of this writ of habeas corpus, You, the marshal of said city, are hereby required to arrest the person or persons so refusing or neglecting to comply, and bring him or them, together with Joseph Smith, forthwith before the municipal court." End quote. Amazingly, the city marshal who received this order from Whiteout Willard Richards, John P. Green, was one of the 18 men in the custody of David Bettesworth when Whiteout Willard Richards issued this order. But if Bettesworth didn't comply with the order, John P. Green, who was in his custody, had an official order to arrest Bettesworth and commit him to the city jail. So if you're a cop and the mayor of the city that you just arrested somebody in swears out a writ of habeas corpus with an extra order that says that your prisoner needs to arrest you if you don't comply with the order, what do? What was David Bettesworth to do in this situation? What could he do other than comply with the laws of Nauvoo? You see, this is an example of how despots retain their power. They make the laws calculated to their own benefit, and everybody who follows those rules only adds to that despotic power. The resolutions that I read through earlier by the anti-Mormon party at Carthage didn't come in a vacuum. They declared a war of extermination because no laws, no resolutions, no ordinances that they passed to legally remedy the Joseph Smith problem could supersede his power in Nauvoo. War seemed like the only answer for them. So the anti-Mormons were playing by the rules in a rigged game, and they decided to turn over the game board. The Nauvoo Municipal Court convened at 5 p.m. that evening, and Bettesworth complied with the order, delivering Joe and his 17 co-conspirators of the city council, the city marshal, as well as members of the Nauvoo Legion, to the Nauvoo Municipal Courtroom. They swore in a few men of the city government to testify to the facts of the public nuisance order and the ordinance concerning libelous publications that we covered over the last 2 episodes. They also slandered the characters of William Law, Francis Higbee, and Charles Foster, testifying that the riot which occurred on the evening that the press was destroyed was all because of Higbee and the other publishers. Now, here's just one of the testimonies. This is important because one of the charges in the arrest warrant was inciting riot. So if they could get enough testimony to prove that it wasn't the marshal or the Nauvoo Legionnaires who started the riot, the charge would be dismissed in the Nauvoo court, of course, and then they could file a writ of double jeopardy in the Carthage court if the Carthage court attempted to try Joseph Smith on riot again. Like I said, Joseph Smith would never agree to be arrested if he didn't have a plan to get out of it. Here's just one of the testimonies. Quote, James Jackson sworn, confirmed the statements of previous witnesses, heard no noise on opening the printing office door. Most of the confusion he heard was Higbee and his company throwing blackguard language to the posse, which they did not regard. Saw the whole proceedings till they were dismissed. All was done in order. Higbee's blackguard language was not only answered to at all by the ranks, heard nothing said about shooting, heard someone damn the city authorities, understood it was Charles Foster. And then he wraps his testimony by saying, I am a stranger in this place, end quote. Another testimony with regards to this came from John P. McEwen, where he alleged that Francis Higbee, quote, said in reference to Joseph Smith, God damn him, I will shoot him, and Hiram Smith, God damn him, I will shoot him, and all that pertains to him, and before 10 suns shall go over our heads, the temple, Nauvoo house, and mansion shall all be destroyed, and it will be the total downfall of this community, end quote. All these people testifying on behalf of Joseph Smith, of course, they don't have any competing testimonies that can contextualize this information. It's propaganda. There's another person named Joseph Dalton who testified that, quote, Higbee said if they, the city council, Joseph Smith, laid their hands on the Expositor press, from that hour they might date their downfall, that 10 suns should not roll over their heads till the city was destroyed, end quote. This is how the Nauvoo Municipal Court worked. Joe pulled the strings, witnesses were produced on his behalf, and the Higbees, the Fosters, and the Laws were never called in to testify on their own behalf. And at the end of the day, quote, court decided that Joseph Smith had acted under proper authority in destroying the establishment of the Nauvoo Expositor, that his orders were executed in an orderly and judicious manner without noise or tumult, that this was a malicious prosecution on the part of Francis M. Higbee, and that said Higbee pay the costs of the suit, and Joseph Smith be honorably discharged from the accusations of the writ and go hence without delay. End quote. So not only was Joseph Smith discharged on all of these offenses, but Francis Higbee was now bound to pay the court fees, which were assessed by Joe's own kangaroo court, which he personally took a cut from as the mayor. I don't have words for this, right? This is how people like Joseph Smith thrive in a world and society, because case law in Nauvoo was binding for the city. The precedent set in this case meant that any riot started by anything the prophet did was acceptable, and any opposition press which attempted to establish itself in the city could be destroyed by Joe's cronies with impunity now. And with the older provisions and ordinances existing in the city, if any officer or constable from any other city like Bettisworth attempted to arrest Joseph Smith to make him answer for any of his crimes, that officer would be arrested, and the Nauvoo court would grant Joe his writ of habeas corpus, and he'd walk free again, just like he did in this case. He always had a plan when he was getting arrested. He was untouchable. But he wasn't immortal. When we discussed the Nauvoo Charter and Doctrine and Covenants Section 124 on the episode, I titled that episode God Mode Joe, because the powers granted by the Nauvoo Charter and D&C 124 were so sweeping and totalitarian. But he was a mortal god, and he could still bleed. Joe knew that once the people of Carthage caught wind of what happened in this Nauvoo municipal court, they would bring the hammer down on him. So the following morning, he was given a copy of the resolution that was passed by the anti-Mormons in Carthage that we just read. But that information went both ways, and the anti-Mormon party met again after learning that Joe had a hearing in the Nauvoo Municipal Court, which dismissed him, quote-unquote, honorably, whatever that means, and charged Francis M. Higbee the court costs. Oh, it's amazing. So the anti-Mormons drafted a new resolution based on testimony provided by Francis Higbee, who attended the Carthage meeting after he lost this case against Joe and was ordered to pay the court fees for it. Quote, "Whereas the officer charged with the execution of a writ against Joseph Smith and others, that's Bettisworth, for riot in the county of Hancock, which said writ said officer has served upon Smith and others, and whereas said Smith and others refuse to obey the mandate of said writ, and whereas in the opinion of this meeting, it is impossible for said officer to raise a posse of sufficient strength to execute said writ, and whereas it is the opinion of this meeting that the riot is still progressing and that violence is mediated and determined on. It is the opinion of this meeting that the circumstances of the case require the interposition of executive power. Therefore, resolved that a deputation of 2 discreet men be sent to Springfield to solicit such interpretation from Governor Thomas Ford, of course. Second, resolved that said deputation be furnished with a certified copy of the resolution and be authorized to obtain evidence by affidavits and otherwise in regard to the violence which has already been committed and is still further mediated." End quote. So the anti-Mormons sent this separate delegation of quote-unquote 2 discreet men to Governor Thomas Ford's office. At the same time, Joe furiously wrote multiple letters to Governor Ford. You see, Joe wasn't sure how well this court ruling in Nauvoo would hold up with the anti-Mormons growing in strength and size and ferociousness every passing day in nearby Carthage, which is only like 15 miles outside of Nauvoo, right? Here's one of his letters, quote, "His Excellency Thomas Ford, Sir, I write you this morning briefly to inform you of the facts relative to the removal of the press and fixtures of the Nauvoo Expositor as a nuisance. After a long and patient investigation of the character of the Expositor and the characters and designs of its proprietors, the Constitution, the Charter, and all the best authorities on the subject, the City Council decided that it was necessary for the peace, benefit, good order, and regulations of said city, and for the protection of property, and for the happiness and prosperity of the citizens of Nauvoo, that said Expositor should be removed. I send you this hasty sketch that your excellency may be aware of the lying reports that are now being circulated by our enemies, that there has been a mob at Nauvoo, and blood and thunder, and swearing that 2 men were killed, etc., 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 as we hear from abroad. They are false as Satan himself could invent, and if your excellency is not satisfied after reading the whole proceedings, and shall demand an investigation of our municipality before Judge Pope or any other legal tribunal at the capital, you have only to write your wishes, and we will be forthcoming, and will not trouble you to fill a writ or send an officer for us. I remain as ever a friend of truth, good order, and your excellency's humble servant. Signed, Joseph Smith. Joe had his friends John M. Bernheisel, Joseph R. Wakefield, and Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon all send letters of good character about Joe to Governor Ford at the same time. Now, these letters are filled with gems. So Bernheisel called Joe, quote, naturally a man of strong mental powers and is possessed of much energy and decision of character, great penetration, all right, and a profound knowledge of human nature. He is a man of calm judgment, enlarged views, and is eminently distinguished by his love of justice, end quote. So, okay, John Bernheisel, go ahead and lie about Joe, but do you have to fill your lies with so many euphemisms? Joseph R. Wakefield said that every assertion in Joe's letter that we just read are, quote, true in every particular, and that the press in the minds of all unprejudiced people was a nuisance of the worst character, and that the authorities acted perfectly proper in destroying it, end quote. Now, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon, his letter to Thomas Ford, focuses less on Joseph Smith than on the persecution complex that he'd been harping on for over a decade as Joe's second in command. Rigdon talks about Joe and those who were arrested being afraid to be carried to Carthage as their lives felt threatened. Quote, with this demand to carry the arrested to Carthage, they refused to comply as there is a large assembly of persons assembled at Carthage making threats of violence. And they say, and I have no doubt verily believe, that by going there their lives will be in danger. And from the intelligence which I received last evening from a person no way connected with the affair, I must think so myself. He heard threatenings by the persons assembled there that if they could get into Nauvoo, that they would murder indiscriminately, and those who wanted to escape must leave. This your excellency will abhor as I do, end quote. Now, Rigdon, being the calculated pragmatist that he was, wraps his letter to Governor Ford with, quote, I send this to your excellency as confidential, as I wish not to take any part in the affair or be known in it, end quote. Hinchpin Rigdon could see the writing on the walls, and he feared the coming blood running through the streets of Nauvoo. After all of these letters were sent to Governor Thomas Ford, Joe held a meeting, quote, with 2 brethren from Lima, Illinois, bearing grave news. Now, Colonel Levi Williams was a powerful enemy of the church who would be tried on the stand later for murdering Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. Levi Williams, quote, had demanded the arms belonging to the Mormons in that neighborhood in Lima, Illinois? I'm not sure how to say that town name. The men who sought the meeting with Joe, they were there to ask what the Mormons should do when members of the Illinois militia, like Colonel Levi Williams, demanded their guns, to which Joe told them, quote, tell them that when they gave up their arms, to give up their lives with them as dearly as possible, end quote. Only give them your guns if they pry the guns from your cold, dead fingers. That was Joseph Smith's advice to the Mormons in Lima, Illinois. These men also brought intel that, quote, a company of men were constantly training at Carthage. Mr. John M. Kane from Warsaw said that several boxes of arms had arrived at Warsaw from Quincy. There was some considerable excitement, end quote. You see, Joe was far from an idiot. He knew that his release from the Nauvoo Municipal Court would only further infuriate these people and fuel the coming fire once they caught word of his release. Also, the orders passed by the anti-Mormon party, those were easier said than done. They called all of the Mormons who were living in Illinois outside of Nauvoo to consolidate to Nauvoo, but there were hundreds of Mormons living in Illinois not inside the boundaries of Nauvoo. Those in great danger for the time being were the hundreds of Mormons living at the Morley settlement, known as Yelrum, which is Morley spelled backwards. See, the Mormons at the Morley settlement, Yelrum, Illinois, they were led by one of the earliest converts of the church from Kirtland, a guy named Isaac Morley. We haven't talked about him in a long time, but he made a lot of appearances in the very, very early Kirtland era of the church. So like episodes 15 through 25 or 30, Isaac Morley is replete throughout those episodes, but he's kind of just been hanging out in the background. So Isaac Morley led the settlement in Yelrum, and what made it so dangerous for those Mormons living in Yelrum was the fact that it was about 30 miles south of Nauvoo. Directly between Nauvoo and Yelrum, in that 30-mile span, was Warsaw, and the road connecting Warsaw to Carthage, where the anti-Mormon fire was raging. So Yelrum was cut off from Nauvoo, and nobody could expect safe passage between Yelrum and Nauvoo without at least being accosted by the anti-Mormons in Warsaw, or worse. The anti-Mormons viewed Yelrum, Illinois, as an opportunity to turn the screws on Joe and to force him into action. So Isaac Morley sent a letter to Joseph Smith to inform him of the situation there at the Morley settlement. Quote, "President Joseph Smith, sir, believing it to be my duty to inform you of the proceedings of a wicked clan against the saints in this place, I improve this opportunity. On yesterday, a Mr. Baker came to my door and said he had some business and wished to speak with me. I went out into my dooryard with him, and he came in company with a Mr. Banks and others. They informed me they were a committee appointed to inform me and our people that they had 3 propositions to make to us. In the first place, yourself and about 17 others had broken the law and good order of the society, that we, the Mormon people, must take up arms and proceed with them for your arrest, or take our effects and proceed immediately to Nauvoo. Otherwise, give up our arms and remain quiet until the fuss is over. We have until Monday morning next to make up our minds. We have made up our minds that we shall not comply with any of these proposals, but stand in our own defense. We have no signature from the governor or any official officer to accept of such wicked proposals." End quote. So that was the proposition that these men came and presented to Isaac Morley in Yelrum, Illinois, 30 miles south of Nauvoo, being intersected by Warsaw. You have 24 hours to decide whether you'll help us arrest your religious and political leader, or you'll be disarmed and forced to Nauvoo, or don't make any problems for us until we handle Joseph Smith. What was Joe's reply to this intel from Isaac Morley? Quote, "You will take special notice of the movements of the mob party that is stirring up strife and endeavoring to excite rebellion to the government and destroy the saints, and cause all the troops of the Nauvoo Legion in your vicinity to be in readiness to act at a moment's warning." End quote. But it wasn't just a reply telling Isaac Morley to ready the troops in Yelrum. There was also strategizing in it. Quote, "If the mob shall fall upon the saints by force of arms, defend them at every hazard, unless prudence dictate the retreat of the troops to Nauvoo. Either come before them or in their rear, and be ready to cooperate with the main body of the legion. Instruct the companies to keep cool, and let all things be done decently and in order." End quote. You see, an Illinois militia marching on to the city of Nauvoo and putting it under siege, as it happened at Far Western Adamondiaman in Missouri, was disadvantageous for the Illinois state militia, because Joseph Smith had satellite companies of the Nauvoo Legion all over the state. As soon as they put the city of Nauvoo under siege, they would immediately be surrounded by the members of the Nauvoo Legion who were in the settlements outside of Nauvoo, like in Yelrum, like in Ramis, like in many of these other Mormon settlements. Joseph Smith had the upper hand in strategy here. He also had the superior numbers. So Joe also told Isaac Morley, Father Morley as we've called him, to send affidavits of everything that happened there to Governor Thomas Ford. Once this letter exchange was complete, Joe resorted to an ultimate option, calling on a higher power to extricate himself from the situation. Not God, but Governor Thomas Ford himself. Quote, His Excellency Thomas Ford, Sir, I am informed from credible sources that an energetic attempt is being made by some of the citizens of this and the surrounding cities to drive and exterminate the saints by force of arms. And I send this information to your excellency by a special messenger who will give all particulars. And I ask at your hands immediate counsel and protection. The Nauvoo Legion is at your service to quell all insurrections and support the dignity of the common will. I urgently wish, your excellency to come down in person with your staff and investigate the whole matter without delay and cause peace to be restored to the country. And I know not, but this will be the only means of stopping an effusion of blood. I remain, sir, the friend of peace and your excellency's humble servant, signed, Joseph Smith. In a tragic repeat of the Missouri-Mormon War, Thomas Ford's personal presence was requested by Joseph Smith, but information took so long to get to him. By the time a messenger traversed the 120 miles to the governor's office in Springfield from Nauvoo, new events had transpired at an exponentially accelerating pace. A skilled single rider with horse exchange stations and well-trained and fit horses could make that 120-mile ride in 2 days with almost no sleep. But an average rider on a single horse taking needed rests and sleeping 6 hours a night would take at least 5 days to make the journey of 120 miles. Then it would be another day getting the meeting with Governor Ford, and then another 5 days to make the journey back with Governor Ford's reply. Everything that we've discussed in this episode so far transpired only over 5 days. During the Missouri-Mormon War, the trip from the Mormon headquarters of Adirondack or Far West to Richmond was even further. The lack of communication made everything here far more complicated, and for that reason, as well as the need to have an authoritative figure on their side, the Mormons petitioned Governor Lilburn Boggs in Missouri to come and handle the situation in person. But communications took too long to reach Governor Boggs, and he received botched intel, and then he signed the Mormon extermination order without ever having stepped foot outside his own office in Richmond. The Mormons learned from this, and I'd like to think that Governor Thomas Ford had learned this as well. So Joe made the earnest plea to the governor of Illinois, Governor Ford, to bring him to Nauvoo to personally handle what was happening. Beyond that, Governor Ford was also receiving communications and meetings from anti-Mormons nearly every day during this affair. Joe wanted to balance out the information that Ford was getting with some Mormon propaganda in order to combat the anti-Mormon propaganda. And beyond that, Joe was intent on spreading propaganda from Nauvoo to places beyond the city limits, as it was becoming increasingly dangerous to be a Mormon in Illinois living outside of Nauvoo. He organized a propaganda campaign similar to that of the traveling propaganda experts dealing with the John C. Reckitt Bennett meltdown for the last 6 months of 1842. So this meeting was held after he had sent the letters to Isaac Morley and Governor Ford. And here are 2 resolutions from that meeting that Joseph Smith held. Quote, Resolved, that inasmuch as many false reports are being circulated through this country by designing characters for the purpose of bringing persecution upon the peaceable citizens of this city, we will use our endeavors to disabuse the public mind and present a true statement of facts before them as speedily as possible. Resolved, that for a more speedy accomplishment of this object, this meeting appoint delegates to go to different precincts throughout the county to lay a true statement of facts before the public. End quote. Then the resolution lists 14 places throughout Illinois and the 24 men tasked with canvassing those areas to spread this Mormon propaganda that was their version, their narrative of the Nauvoo Expositor being a public nuisance, right? These men were expected to risk their lives in hostile areas and tell people a message they didn't want to hear in a futile attempt to preserve the life of their prophet. When Joe returned from that meeting, a letter from his uncle, John Smith, was awaiting him. Quote, President Smith, we send you 2 faithful brethren who will give you all the information which is within our knowledge of the proceedings of our enemies. We should have sought your counsel sooner, but only on account of high water we could not. End quote. Here is Joe's reply, quote, Uncle John, we were glad to see the brethren from Ramus, and to hear that you were all alive in the midst of the ragings of an infatuated and bloodthirsty mob. I write these few lines to inform you that we feel determined in this place not to be dismayed if all hell boils over at once. We feel to hope for the best and determined to prepare for the worst. And we want this to be your motto in common with us, that we will never ground our arms until we give them up by death. Free trade and sailors' rights, protection of persons and property, wives and family. If a mob annoy you, defend yourselves to the very last. And if they fall upon you with a superior force and you think you are not able to compete with them, retreat to Nauvoo. Remember the front and the rear of your enemies, because if they should come to Nauvoo to attack it unlawfully by a mob force, a little annoyance upon the rear with some bold fellows would be a very good thing to weaken the ranks of an enemy. Joe had the Nauvoo, or the Illinois state militia, surrounded if they just decided to siege Nauvoo. It is impossible to give you correct information what to do beforehand, but act according to the emergency of the case, but never give up your arms, but die first. We have sent to the governor and are about to send again, and we want you to send affidavits and demand the attention of the governor and request protection at his hand in common with the rest of us. End quote. So as Joe was exchanging these letters with his Uncle John, with Isaac Morley, sending letters to Governor Thomas Ford, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, his older brother, was also drafting letters to all of the members of the Quorum of Apostles. Now, the letter retained in the Joseph Smith Papers archive and reprinted in the History of the Church is to Bloody Brigham Young, but the handwritten draft on the Joseph Smith Papers lists the names of the various apostles and their locations, meaning a copy of this letter was made and sent to each of the members of the Quorum of Apostles. Now, this letter is tragic when we consider what it really means. Each of these men of the Quorum of Apostles were out electioneering and meeting with politicians in order to elevate Joe's presidential campaign. Most of them had been out of the state of Illinois for weeks by the time these letters were sent to them. Why this is tragic is because Joe was a smart guy, and as evidence of that intelligence, he surrounded himself with people who were equally or more intelligent with particular sets of skills. Whenever each of these men spoke about anything with regards to his leadership or tough decisions that he had to make, Joe listened to them. He really did listen to what these men had to say. Now, Joe may have been headstrong and confrontational, but he was smart enough to recognize good advice when it was given. The Council of 50 Minutes, the City Council Minutes, the High Council Minutes, all of these are filled with page after page of Joe asking for the advice of his counselors, listening to what they say and dealing with the information they provided, and often making decisions based on their advice. Now, many of these guys were yes men and sycophants who would do anything the prophet said without any opposition, but there were others, like Lyman White and Bloody Brigham Young, who had a spine to push back and give candid advice to the prophet when it was most needed. The aldermen of the city and most of the city councilors, they were lemmings, right? But the highest ranking leaders in the church, it was a much more healthy mix of intellect and expertise. The decision to pass the city ordinance concerning libelous publications and declaring the Nauvoo Expositor a public nuisance, which led to this storm of chaos, that was all made without Joe's closest advisors there telling him that these were bad ideas. Had Bloody Brigham Young been present for those city council meetings, I'm of the opinion that the expositor never would have been burned, and American history would look very different today. Instead, the rational voices were nowhere near the city to temper Joe's irrational tendencies. So, the tragic part about these letters is that almost all of them wouldn't be received before Joseph and Hiram were dead. Johnny Page was in Pittsburgh. Heber the Creeper Kimball was in Washington, D.C. with Orson Pratt. George A. Smith, cousin of Joe and Hiram Smith and son of Uncle John Smith, was in New Hampshire. Willie Goat Wilford Woodruff was in Portage County, New York, not far from Joe's old stomping grounds, with P-Cubed Parley Parker Pratt, somewhere in the state of New York as well. Amasa Lyman was in Cincinnati. Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willie Smith, was with Orson Lahidem in Philadelphia. The Wild Ram of the Mountains, Lyman White, was in Baltimore, and Bloody Brigham Young was in Boston. The letter we're about to read was sent on June 20th, 1844. They wouldn't be received by the recipients of them for at least 2 weeks, but just 7 days after they were sent, Joseph and Hiram Smith lay dead in a wagon entering Nauvoo, surrounded by sobbing friends and family. When each of the men opened their letters, it was too late. Quote, "Dear Brother Brigham Young, there has been for several days a great excitement among the inhabitants in the adjoining counties. Mass meetings are held upon mass meeting, drawing up resolutions to utterly exterminate the saints. The excitement has been gotten up by the Laws, Fosters, and Higbees, and they themselves have left the city and are engaged in the mob. They have sent their runners into the state of Missouri to excite them to murder and bloodshed, and the report is that a great many hundreds of them will come over to take an active part in murdering the saints. The excitement is very great indeed. It is thought best by myself and others for you to return without delay, and the rest of the 12 and all the elders that have gone out from this place, and as many more good faithful men as feel disposed to come up with them. Let wisdom be exercised, and whatever they do, do it without a noise. You knew we are not frightened, but think it best to be well prepared and be ready for the onset, and if it is extermination, extermination it is, of course. Communicate with the others of the 12 with as much possible speed, with perfect stillness and calmness. A word to the wise is sufficient, and a little powder and lead and a good rifle can be packed in your luggage very easy without creating any suspicion. There must be no excuses made, for wisdom says that a strict compliance with this request will be for our safety and welfare. In haste, I remain yours in the firm bonds of the new and everlasting covenant. Signed, Hiram Smith. Postscript. Large bodies of armed men, cannon and munitions of war are coming on from Missouri in steamboats. These facts are communicated to the governor and president of the United States, and you will readily see that we have to prepare for the onset. In the bonds of the new and everlasting covenant, I remain yours. Signed, Joseph Smith. The desperation, the urgency, the grasping at straws for any comforting hand when war was imminent and inevitable. When each of these 12 men finally broke the wax seal of the prophet containing this letter, the authors of it had already breathed their last breath. The days all these letters were exchanged was Sunday, June 16th, 1844. This day also contained one of Joe's final sermons on the Godhead. And he reiterates many of the points made in the King Follett Discourse, but there are a few extra points worthy of mention. Quote, I testify again, as the Lord lives, God never will acknowledge any traitors or apostates. Any man who will betray the Catholics will betray you, and if he will betray me, he will betray you. All men are liars who say they are of the true church without the revelations of Jesus Christ and the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is after the order of the Son of God. It is in the order of heavenly things that God should always send a new dispensation into the world when men have apostatized from the truth and lost the priesthood. But when men come out and build upon other men's foundations, they do it on their own responsibility without authority from God. And when the floods come and the winds blow, their foundations will be found to be sand, and their whole fabric will crumble to dust. Did I build on any other man's foundation? I have got all the truth which the Christian world possessed, and an independent revelation in the bargain, and God will bear me off triumphant. End quote. After Joe made this Sunday speech, this sermon, he went to the temple construction grounds where he met, quote, some thousands of the brethren. I instructed them to keep cool and prepare their arms for defense of the city, as it was reported that a mob was collecting in Carthage and other places, end quote. Now, these men of the Brethren, these were obviously the majority of the Nauvoo Legion, and he was preparing them for the next Mormon War. That evening, he then went to the Masonic Lodge, where a Judge Jesse B. Thomas, quote, advised me to go before some justice of the peace of the county and have an examination of the charges specified in the writ from Justice Morrison of Carthage, and if acquitted or bound over, it would allay all excitement, answer the law, and cut off all legal pretext for a mob, and he would be bound to order them to keep the peace, end quote. Joe went home and considered the advice of this judge that he had met in the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, and then he went to bed, and he probably didn't get a lick of sleep because war was inevitable. Then Joseph Smith woke up the next morning, and he was arrested again for a second trial in a week in the Nauvoo Municipal Court. And here is where we will leave our prophet and criminal kingpin to pick up in coming episodes. Now, there are a number of consequential angles to consider with everything that happened in the single week that we just discussed on the show today. There are the three prongs of power dynamics, each with competing interests to weigh in the balance. First prong, there was the Mormon side, which had a few integrated levels of interest to consider. The average Mormon, they wanted to live their life, and they wanted to contribute to building the kingdom of God, whatever that meant, right? But then there was the Mormon leadership, directed by the prophet, priest, and king Joseph Smith, who was on an unstoppable path of avarice and ambition. Joe wanted nothing more than to grow his empire and bring the entire world under his control. An autocrat like Joe is never truly satisfied with the boundaries of his empire, no matter how vast. The second competing power dynamic prong to consider here was the anti-Mormons, which also had a number of integrated levels of interest, right? The average citizen of Illinois simply wanted to live their life and let others do the same. They didn't want their money and property stolen, and they didn't want to be swindled by counterfeit money. And they really wanted their neighbors to pay their bills, right? So then there were also the violence-seeking vocal minority who comprised the anti-Mormon political party. They wanted the leadership of the church to answer for their crimes. If that meant marching a state militia into the city of Nauvoo and burning it to the ground to remove every single Mormon from the state, then so be it. That strategy worked in Missouri, so why not in Illinois? Then we have the third competing power dynamic prong to consider: the government, personified by Governor Thomas Ford. The two competing interests discussed previously were mutually exclusive, right? Mormons and anti-Mormons act as matter and antimatter. Whichever has the greatest presence cancels out the other and stands as the remaining force. That presents us some interesting questions when we consider this growing conflict from the perspective of Governor Thomas Ford. The guy wanted peace in his state, and governors in the mid-19th century held considerably more power than governors do today. The Civil War would see the growth of the federal government and the correlated shrinkage of the power of governors, but that was still 20 years in the future. So what was Governor Thomas Ford to do? He was a wise guy, and he knew that the non-Mormons were looking for any opportunity to march into Nauvoo with guns and bowie knives and take justice the old-fashioned American way. And he recounts in his History of Illinois, circa 1852, the turmoil and the conflict and the plans of the non-Mormon, the anti-Mormon militia, discussing why they wanted to have Governor Ford's blessing to enter the city of Nauvoo. Now quoting Governor Thomas Ford, quote, he's writing this with hindsight, which is quite notable as well. We need to always remember that we are looking at all of these events with hindsight. We know what happens, but the people who were in the middle of it, they didn't have the foresight to know the consequences of their actions. So we can see the conflict and the anxiety in Governor Ford's own language while he's recalling the events. Quote, I observed that some of the people became more and more excited and inflammatory the further the militia preparations were advanced. Occasional threats came to my ears of destroying the city and murdering or expelling the inhabitants. I had no objection to ease the terrors of the people by such a display of military force, and was most anxious also to search for the alleged apparatus for making counterfeit money, and in fact to inquire into all the charges against that people, if I could have been assured of my command against mutiny and insubordination. But I gradually learned, to my entire satisfaction, that there was a plan to get the troops into Nauvoo and there to begin the war, probably by some of our own party or some of the seceding Mormons, taking advantage of the night to fire on our own force and then laying it on the Mormons. I was satisfied that there were those amongst us fully capable of such an act, hoping that in the alarm, bustle, and confusion of a militia camp, the truth could not be discovered, that it might lead to the desired collision." End quote. He knew there would be a shot heard round the world if the state militia were to enter Nauvoo, and nobody could determine who fired the first shot, who was responsible for it. Now, he also alluded to something in the counterfeit money apparatus. That counterfeit money thing, that's a much larger point. And I know that I said last week that we would discuss Joseph H. Jackson this week, but I decided to push it out for next week for a few good reasons. But most importantly is that we can't discuss counterfeit money in Nauvoo without talking Joseph H. Jackson, and the inverse is also true. It was a huge problem. Joseph H. Jackson was one of the central figures of the counterfeit money operation in Nauvoo. We're going to talk about that next week. After that passage, Governor Ford makes a larger assessment about how it would more likely go down once his state militia was gathered if they weren't able to make it into the city of Nauvoo. Now look, he's writing this with the 30,000-foot view of the situation, and with hindsight, right? Quote, "I was openly and boldly opposed to any attack on the city of Nauvoo, unless it should become necessary to arrest prisoners legally charged and demanded. Indeed, if any one will reflect upon the number of women, inoffensive and young persons, and innocent children which must be contained in a city of 12 or 15,000 inhabitants, it would seem to me his heart would relent and rebel against such violent resolutions. No one who has children of his own would think of it for a moment. Besides this, if we had been ever so much disposed to commit such an act of wickedness, we evidently had not the power to do it. I was well assured that the Mormons at a short notice could muster as many as 2,000 or 3,000 well-armed men. We had not more than 1,700 with 3 pieces of cannon and about 1,200 stand of small arms. We had provisions for 2 days only and would be compelled to disband at the end of that time. To think of beginning a war under such circumstances was plain absurdity. If the Mormons had succeeded in repulsing our attack, as most likely would have been the case, the country must necessarily be given up to their ravages until a new force could be assembled and provisions made for its subsistence. Or, if we should have succeeded in driving them from their city, they would have scattered, and being justly incensed at our barbarity and suffering with privation and hunger, would have spread desolation all over the country, without any possibility on our part, with the force we then had, of preventing it. Again, they would have had the advantage of being able to subsist their force in the field by plundering the enemies." End quote. He's right on every point. The Mormon militia was one of the largest militias in the nation. The national forces could only muster with support and provisions as many as 8,000 soldiers at any given time in the 1840s. The Mormon militia was larger than anything that Governor Thomas Ford could gather in any reasonable amount of time without support from the federal government. The Mormons would win the battle. Then what? Joe had worked so hard to make his settlement above the critical mass necessary to be able to flaunt all laws and have a large enough militia to enforce that impunity. And he had reached that critical mass, and Governor Ford knew it. The anti-Mormons had so much pent-up rage that they wanted to express by shooting them some damned Joeites. The Mormons wanted to live in peace inside their own theocracy without any legal oversight. The governor wanted to keep the peace. These competing desires that don't work with each other ensured escalating tensions, and chaos would be the inevitable result. The words of Joseph Smith from just a week before the Expositor was published echo through my mind. The Expositor publishers, when he gave this sermon, they had formed their own church with William Law at the helm. The prospectus of the Expositor had been published. The Expositor itself was being written and printed, not yet published. Joseph was more vulnerable at this time than he had been in years because all of his closest advisors and leadership, safety net, they were all over the country at this time. Joe stood at the head of a few thousand Mormons, gathered for Sunday worship service on May 26th, 1844, just a little more than 2 weeks after the entire week that we discussed in the episode today, knowing at the time the publishers of the Expositor were about to ignite a blaze throughout the city. I have been in perils, and oftener than anyone in this generation. As Paul boasted, I have suffered more than Paul did. I should be like a fish out of water if I were out of persecution. Perhaps my brethren think it requires all this to keep me humble. The Lord has constituted me so curiously that I glory in persecution. I am not near so humble as if I were not persecuted. If oppression will make a wise man mad, much more a fool. If they want a beardless boy to whip all the world, I will get on the top of a mountain and crow like a rooster. I shall always beat them. God is in the still small voice. In all these affidavits, indictments, it is all of the devil, all corruption. Come on, ye prosecutors, ye false swearers, all hell boil over, ye burning mountains, roll down your lava, for I will come out on top at last. I have more to boast of than ever any man had. I am the only man that has ever been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. A large majority of the whole have stood by me. Neither Paul, John, Peter, nor Jesus ever did it. I boast that no man ever did such a work as me. The followers of Jesus ran away from him. The Latter-day Saints never ran away from me yet. You know my daily walk and conversation. I am in the bosom of a virtuous and good people. How I do love to hear the wolves howl. When they can get rid of me, the devil will also go. The only difference is, this time, the howling wolves will drink the blood of a god. That's going to do it for our episode today. Next week, we're finally going to cover Joseph H. Jackson. I wanted to get Joseph arrested and released and back under arrest before we kind of tackle Joseph H. Jackson because it's really, really complicated. He's a complicated figure, and you can't discuss him without talking about counterfeit and bogus making in Nauvoo, and that was obviously one of the major pressures that we're pushing on the people not liking the Mormons in Nauvoo was all of the counterfeit money that was going around. So we'll deal with that next week. I'm sorry that I said last week we were going to do Joseph H. Jackson this week, but he slotted in better to do him next week. Anyway, we do have one new patron to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and it is just by Adam. Adam, the first patron. No, not really. So Adam, thank you so much for pledging to support the show. Patron supporters of the show get an extra episode every week, unless it was like this week where the Glassbox podcast episode was a bit more time consuming than expected, and I just didn't have the time to put out an extra episode. But every other week, I'll get an extra episode on the Patreon exclusive feed, as well as an extended edition of every new episode with just kind of the variety show, me just chatting at the end. So if that interests you, and you are in a position that you're able to support the show, patreon.com/nakedmormonism. I've also received a number of messages from people who have, canceled or reduced their subscriptions on Patreon. there's no need for that. I totally understand. This is a time of society in March and April of 2020 where things are kind of tough and things are kind of uncertain right now. And if you need to cancel your support or you need to put things on hold, that's totally cool. I understand it. There's no need to apologize. And you know what? We're going to be fine over here at Ground Gnome Studios, so make sure that you take care of yourself. And I acknowledge that supporting a podcast, that is a luxury expenditure. Make sure that whatever you're doing, that you are providing for yourself, for your family, and if there's anything left over, consider throwing it our way. Otherwise, if you are unable to support the show, hey, giving us a 5-star review, that doesn't cost any money. It only costs a few minutes, and a lot of us are locked home anyway without being able to go outside or do much of anything right now, so that really does help with the visibility of the show and increasing our visibility on various podcast aggregators. So if you can leave us a 5-star review or a thumbs up or like and subscribe to the show in whatever podcasting app you use, that helps a ton as well. And that is the next best way to support the show. And if you do that, you help us get closer to reaching our goal of starting a Mormon history themed D&D campaign. Back on episode 200, that was the second half of the episode. So if that was fun, if you enjoyed that on episode 200, share it and let us know that you shared it, and we'll get you added to the extra special list of those people who shared the show with friends or family members that will get access to those D&D podcast episodes. One more thing I wanted to mention in conjunction with the latest Glassbox podcast episode that was, it was almost 4 hours long. We covered General Conference. If you want to listen to our coverage, Braden and Mai's coverage of General Conference, consider listening to that episode 44 of the Glassbox podcast. It was a grind. But if you have friends and family members who are sharing conference talks and you want to know what the central message is and all of the other talks that were going on, hey, consider checking that out. Also, I wanted to give a plug to the most recent episode of How to Heretic podcast. It's episode 134, where the audio uncles go through a little bit of conference as well as the kind of cult tendencies of the church. And they even had a Stephen Hassan on, who is, considered a very well-respected cult expert, to talk about cult tendencies, what makes a cult, and it really was an exceptional episode. I catch almost every episode of How to Heretic, but I thought that this episode really stood out with the material they covered as well as with the special guests that they had on. And they also plugged the show at the very end. So thanks to the audio uncles, listen to How to Heretic. You'll find an episode or a link to episode 134 in the show notes for this week's episode. Lots of good content out there, lots of good content creators. So with that, let's go ahead and wrap the show. I want to thank everybody who listened to the end of the show, everybody who is listening right now. I want to thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.